Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. In today's video, we are going to be unpacking some accusations against none other than Beethoven. In the comment section of a recent video of mine discussing Beethoven's third piano concerto, which I'll link in the description below, a comment from a friend of the channel brought to my attention some recent scholarship that I was unaware of. The professor, Julian Horton, in the opening chapter of his recently published book on Schumann's piano concerto, makes some claims regarding the form of Beethoven's piano concertos. Watch out, British spellings ahead. I was intrigued, so I got a copy of this book, which on the whole is very good, but there's an interesting section at the beginning. For Tovey, Mozart accessed a kind of generic ideal type, central to which is the idea that the opening orchestral ritornello should resemble a sonata exposition, except that the second theme appears in the tonic. Tovey regarded this as essential for two reasons. First, because it leaves the way clear for the soloist to introduce a structural modulation. And second, because a non-tonic orchestral second theme presentation is the defining event of a symphonic sonata exposition, which means that preserving the modulation for the soloist is vital for differentiating concerti from symphonies. Tovey traced this error to Beethoven, specifically his first three piano concerti, opus 15, 19, and 37. Beethoven's error was duly replicated in other 19th century concertos until Brahms came to the rescue. The opening tutti of the classical concerto remained a mystery to composers and theorists alike. And in that final sentence, Horton is quoting Tovey directly. Just in this two-paragraph excerpt from Horton's book, there's a lot to unpack. And we'll be doing all of that unpacking in this video. We'll go back to Horton's original source, Donald Francis Tovey, briefly examine the exposition of Beethoven's first two piano concertos, I'll leave the third aside as I have a full video on it, and finally, we'll discuss what Beethoven, Tovey, and Horton may or may not have gotten wrong. First, let's examine the concerti to determine whether or not they even do modulate, and why that might not be as straightforward as one would suppose. We'll be moving through these concerti much more quickly than I typically do, and only discussing the first ritornello exposition of each. But before we move on to the end of the transition and medial caesura, I want to point out the key and how it's established. For a second, assume you're seeing and hearing the music for the first time, and you don't know that Beethoven has designated it in C major. Obviously, just by looking at the first few bars, any musician could tell you we're in that key. But what actually solidifies the key is the cadence that occurs here. Until the cadence point, the key is not fully determined. This is why in sonata theory, Hepokoski and Darcy use terms like over and under determination for a primary theme. When a theme cadences multiple times, it is overdetermined. When it either doesn't cadence or perhaps only manages a half cadence, it is underdetermined. Both have implications for an interpretation of the theme, but in this case, the theme is simply a typical example of a primary theme. It ends in a PAC. Jumping ahead to the end of the transition, you can see, again, a typical medial caesura for the first ritornello of a concerto. We haven't modulated, this is a half cadence in the tonic C major. But as you can see, what's unusual about this concerto is that it's modulated into E flat major, the global flattened mediant. Eventually, however, it becomes clear that this opening of the secondary theme could be considered an off-tonic feint, as eventually the tonic reasserts itself. You can see why I went on an extended monologue about the key of the primary theme. When you look at the opening of the secondary theme, it's clearly in E-flat major, but what's missing is the important cadential point in that key. Instead, Beethoven pivots back to and cadences in C major. Let's move on to the second concerto. Again, we can see that the opening primary theme is typically determined. It's obviously in the tonic of B-flat major and cadences in that same key. However, the transitions ending is slightly altered in this work. What's atypical is that this medial caesura, if it can even be called that, does not occur on a cadence. We would say it may have achieved its rhetorical goal, but not its tonal goal. We haven't changed key, but the increasing tension of the transition indicates that it's having difficulty opening S space. When the secondary theme does enter, again it's in the flattened mediant, D-flat major. Again, we can see in this exposition what initially appeared to be an extremely deformational practice actually pivots back towards the norm. The ritornello exposition again concludes in the tonic. In my video on the third piano concerto, you can see a nearly identical trajectory to its opening ritornello. So, what are we to make of this? We know from Horton that this move is regarded, by some at least, to be an actual compositional error. Specifically, Horton references the theorist Donald Francis Tovey. Tovey, who lived from 1875 to 1940, was an English writer, musical analyst, and composer. At its best, his analyses, collected in the multi-volume Essays on Musical Analysis, serve as a bridge between experts and amateurs. But his work is generally considered to be outdated. In my experience, I mostly come across his name as a way for academics to reference what people were thinking of form during the time period in which Tovey lived. That's the way it's used by Horton. Whether that's an accurate way to view Tovey, unclear. Probably not an approach I would take. Tovey has this to say about Beethoven's early concerti. The first three pianoforte concertos of Beethoven show, in the opening tutti of their first movements, a phenomenon almost unique in his works. In other branches of music, we may find signs of a struggle with stubborn material, and Beethoven himself sometimes admitted that for this or that problem of vocal and dramatic music, he had not studied enough. In all three concertos, the nature of the opening tutti is radically misconceived, and that of the C minor concerto, that's number 3, is an advance upon the other two only inasmuch as Beethoven seems to discover the error at the moment of committing it, with the result that its tutti executes a charmingly dramatic volte-face in mid-career, as if to say, but no, I must not be the beginning of a symphony. That line, but no, I must not be the beginning of a symphony, will return later. But the crux of this passage is Tovey marveling at an apparent mistake made by Beethoven. If you've been watching the channel for any amount of time, you know that a theorist or a reviewer claiming that a composer's music contains a mistake is a particular pet peeve of mine. I find it a little arrogant to assume that rather than acknowledging the potential of a composer doing something outside of the analyst's comprehension, the technique is dismissed as a mistake. Granted, this is the first time I find myself rallying my energy to defend Beethoven. That's typically reserved for composers like Schubert, Chopin, or Tchaikovsky, but it equally applies here. The mistake in question in Tovey's writing is actually slightly more complex than it's presented by Horton. For what it's worth, this video is meant more as a Tovey hit piece than a Horton one. Tovey is not only claiming that Beethoven's modulation into another key is a mistake, one which he argues spun out into the 19th century, causing the majority of composers to abandon the concerto or type 5 form, but specifically, Tovey is saying that modulating in the opening ritornello is a mistake because it takes away from the vital necessity of the soloist to emerge as champion of the form. That by modulating in the ritornello, the soloist's unique role in a ritornello form is rendered inert. But how unusual is it really to modulate in the opening ritornello? Well, as it turns out, not really that unusual. Or rather, not unusual depending on what you consider to be a modulation. The section on type 5 sonata forms in Hepokoski and Darcy's book, Elements of Sonata Theory, is almost exclusively focused on the works of Mozart, not Beethoven, and yet they have this to say about the practice. R1S, the ritornello secondary theme, is almost always stated in the tonic key throughout. More precisely, in Mozart's type 5s, the R1 EEC always secures the original tonic. And in the large majority of cases, R1S also begins in the tonic key, following a 1 HCMC. Thus, one expects as a strong first level default that R1S will remain in the tonic throughout. The very strength of this norm throws into vivid relief the few exceptions of it. Those instances where R1S begins in the non-tonic key that would be appropriate were this a sonata exposition rather than ritornello 1 of a type 5 sonata. In all cases, this purposeful S misstep is corrected en route, and the R1S soon restabilizes back to the original tonic. The tonal correction is a definitive declaration of the genre at hand. No, this is not a symphony, this is a concerto. The non-tonic feint and quote-unquote decision aspect of the subsequent correction are mechanisms that draw attention to what this piece is, to its very concerto-ness. Hepokoski and Darcy go on to detail 3 Mozart concerti which take this novel approach, numbers 11, 14, and most famously 20 in D minor, which is not so coincidentally a concerto that Beethoven knew very well. He performed it multiple times and wrote his own cadenzas for it. So, right off the bat, Tovey is wrong in thinking that this is unprecedented, and even in placing the blame for the disappearance of concerto form on Beethoven's shoulders. As to whether this opening modulation, if a snatch of music without cadence can even be called such, lessens the need for the soloists, I discussed this briefly in my video on the 3rd piano concerto, but in my opinion, it merely calls for a reframing of the soloist's role within the work. In a typical ritornello form, the soloist is responsible for modulating to and from distant keys. In Beethoven's first 3 concerti, rather than being responsible for modulation, it is the soloist's role to maintain that modulation, which the orchestra is incapable of doing in their own exposition. As for what Horton got wrong, let me put his quote on the screen again. The bolded passages are my addition, so I'm not reading an entire book to you, but I want to draw your attention to Horton's punctuation here. Error in scare quotes. Frankly, I find these quotes confusing. Is Horton intending to say that this is not a mistake on Beethoven's part, but rather a mistake on Tovey's? Or does he mean exactly the opposite? Or possibly a secret third meaning? For an academic who I find at times mind-numbingly specific, this total lack of specificity was disappointing. But what I take away from this passage, and the larger chapter it appears within, is Horton's attempt at framing how concerto forms are often viewed by academics, and how, just as often, the 19th century concerto can be the ugly duckling of analytical writing. That is a very good point, and I think it is made much better in his other book on Brahms' Second Piano Concerto. I want to wrap up this video by pointing out that this process, that of identifying a divergence from a normal approach to form, in this case, Beethoven's foray into an unusual key in the ritornello exposition of a concerto, and then, importantly, assuming that, rather than being a mistake or an error on the part of the composer, as Tovey thought, that it is more likely a deliberate choice made to convey meaning. This is, in my opinion, the greatest strength that sonata theory brings to the analytical table. The codification of generic layouts for these forms, as well as providing tools to interpret their meaning when composers both adhere to and stray from these models, is something that I have not come across in other analytical methods, and which I feel enhances both my understanding of this music as well as my enjoyment of it, something which I consider to be the main function of music theory, at least in my life. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was a little different than my usual content, but I thought it was worth saying, although I am a little sorry about the clickbait title. If you would like to support the channel for any amount, even just $1, you can do so at patreon.com/sonatashewrote. There's a Discord, there's bonus videos, there's ad-free copies of my videos. It's a real hoot, and I really appreciate everyone who has joined. You're seeing them on the screen now. As always, thank you for joining me.